Hello, I'm Dr. Ed Baker, and welcome again to another conversation on leadership. And today I'm particularly thrilled to be talking with my friend and colleague, Dr. Stephanie Bailey, here at CDC in Atlanta. Dr. Bailey is now the Chief of Public Health Practice at CDC, formerly Local Health Director in Nashville, Tennessee, where I've visited you a number of times, and also past President of NACCHO, the National Association of County and City Health Officials. Stephanie, thanks for doing this with me today.
You're quite welcome. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Let's start in with just sort of a first question. Is your early influences, mentors, people that had influence on your leadership journey, tell us a little bit about how that happened for you, what lessons you learned, what was that like early on?
You know, I get this kind of question a lot, and it gives me an opportunity to honor some key people who remind me of humility and remind me of where I came and give me my base for doing what I do. And I'll just quickly, I can name about 5, but let me just name 4. I'll start with my father. And I'll put it in 2 categories. One is what I call porch consultation, and the other is what I call work ethics. My father, we lived in a small town on the eastern shore of Denton on Maryland. And during the time when I was growing up, it was segregation. You know, one side of Denton was all black and the other side was all white. But it's just amazing as I reflect back on growing up and watching my father. From our porch, he had people visiting him from the white community, from the black community, young and old, and he had what I would hear as people visited him was his wisdom, his caring. I hear the respectability. It even was a sense of diplomacy, how he dealt with the different facets during that time. So I guess the fairness as well. All those things come through respectability. So that was my father as we sat on our porch. And many people, we were the house where people gathered, by the way. And then my mother on the other side. My mother, very bold, direct, took no prisoners, you know, but she had a humor. And she also had the moments where she showed pain, but always when she was not in front of everybody, what I call not on stage. So you talk about characteristics of being direct, being open and honest, being bold, but also tapering that with humor. I think those sort of things came from my mother. I'll step back up to the work ethics with my father, and I'll tell the story of my father was only went to the 9th grade, and he worked as a mechanic all of his life. And I always wondered, I always heard the stories of how other men who he trained would end up being the head or the foreman, or what we would call the supervisor in roles. And I stayed angry from the time I was little until the time of my father's death, because I thought that he was being discriminated against, that he had the talents and he wasn't getting the promotions. And I was mad at the company until they came to the funeral and they talked about how they recognized the talents of my father. He never wanted to assume that. So from that I learned he promoted other people, he trained other people, he was all right in that role, he was not a whiner, and he had a lot of self-confidence. He knew who he was, and so you can see me, I'm beaming. I'm very proud to be the product of those 2 people. Outside of my parents, let me talk about the person who hired me on at the health department, Dr. Frida Wadley. Well, she didn't hire me on, but I worked under her. She became the 2nd director I served under at the health department. There was one day when I was got a call from someone who did not want to be working in a small town in Mississippi because of the National Health Service Corps. And he wanted to come and work in Nashville because of all the secondary and tertiary support. And that clinic where he was working was going to close, because he was only seeing his specialty. And I was sort of sad because here I was sitting in a desk, and I could have been in that small town in Mississippi seeing 50 patients a day. And how dare I sit here when I could be out there to keep that clinic from closing. And Frida came through, and she saw me distraught, and she said, Stephanie, from this vantage point, you can affect the lives of 565,000 people. That was Nashville's population. So that was an aha for me. So what that taught me as a leader was that, maintaining the long view and constancy of purpose, One other person I'd just like to mention is Ed Baker. Surprise, surprise. But you gave me a poem once by Marianne Williamson. And the essence of that poem was, it's somewhat on the Bible too as well, but it was about letting your talents shine, own them, and let that be your strength. I always managed with courage and integrity, but I always subdued myself as far as letting my talents show because of earlier experiences where, you grow up, people think you're smart, you think you're this, and, they alienate yourself from you because you had all of these talents. So I began to make them very subordinate. But the poem you gave me many years ago, early in our friendship, was as well a leadership mentoring moment, just making the point that it doesn't necessarily have to be people directly, but it could be things we read, it could be a conversation, it could be something you notice in other people. So I just wanted to put those four perspectives because it makes, it sort of rounds out who I am, as I progress in the leadership roles that I have.
I'm very honored to be in that company. Thank you so much. That's quite moving. Transition, if you will, for Stephanie, over into sort of, and you've kind of touched on this already, those attributes, some of which you certainly embody yourself, some of which you picked up, if you will, from the influences that you've had in your life. But if you could point to certain things that you see as really key attributes of a leader that really make that person effective, what would some of those things be?
Well, it's been my observation, Ed, that most leaders, when you ask this question, I probably will come up with things that are not different from those. Trustworthiness, respectfulness. I will add being a good observer and a good listener. Those things have afforded me some advances that I think that makes me who I am today. The other is sensing and being able to be like a periscope and be able to understand what's going on around you so you can use those and take advantage of those in order to strategize better. But I think when it comes down to it, it is a sense of creating trust, relationships, trustworthiness, being an observer, listening, sensing, and being able to really respect people in a way. It might be by looking in their eyes. It might be by just noticing their name on the tag as they're taking your bags into a hotel and saying, thank you, Steve, for doing this. So I think those are the traits, at least that I have learned along the way, that have I've gotten feedback on and affirmation on throughout the years to know that they're working for me.
I remember, I think it was in Nashville, I was there with you one time. It was a meeting or something. And I noticed how you entered the room and how you connected with people. You did exactly what you just said.
Some
and you
people
know
say I
their name.
enter a room. Some people say I enter a room and I'm more than 5 foot tall, that I have this presence about me. So thank you.
Well, the thing that was so wonderful, I thought, was that you were connecting
Yeah.
with people for who they are, not so much for what they were doing. If you know what I mean, you saw that person, sort of the essence, it seemed to me.
That's right.
And I could see in their face just like, well, like we were together in Nashville a few
Yes.
weeks back, and people just were so thrilled because they were able to just, you know, interact with you. Let's focus. I remember going over, as I said, to your health department a number of times. This issue of leading organizational change is something that all of us who have been in leadership positions really need to think more about. Talk, if you would, Stephanie, a little bit about that process, how you led organizational change when you became health director in Nashville, because I visited you there. I know that you went through some steps. Talk us through how you actually went about doing that.
I think the biggest issue for me when I became director can be summed up with communication. And even you yourself have talked about how communication is just so key to getting ahead and to even organizational change. The morale, the way people were doing things or not doing things in the organization was just so depreciating of an organization. So the first thing I did was address communication. I remember the first, when I became director, within a day or two, I had to address the Board of Health. And I wrote out my comments to the Board of Health about this new venture that I'm on and had the agenda for the Board of Health. The very next day, I had scheduled an all-hands meeting, so to speak. And the first thing I said was, so tell me what you have heard about the meeting last night. My point was to get at rumors, to get at, you know, people being responsible for communicating, whether hearing it or transmitting it. So several people stood up and said what they heard, and of course they went from what actually happened to way off to the fact that my husband was divorcing me and we were going to be, you know, I wasn't going to be there long. From just one 24-hour period. So I then passed out exactly what I said. And subsequent meetings, almost maybe once a quarter, we would do that telephone conversation, that telephone game that you used to play, you know, how you whisper into the ear of people. So I divide up the staff in 2 rows each, and we'd have a public health message, and it could be simple as, we don't want to eat hamburgers at McDonald's, something like that. And then at the end of those each 2 rows, I would have them stand up and have everybody say what they heard. And of course, I had what the actual beginning was. And it's that kind of realization and making people really understand with real examples how irresponsible conversation can happen. Your fault, no fault, you know, just listening skills, how you're saying things. So we really address communication. We also address getting ourselves out there in the community, not letting the building sort of stand between us. We address standards, like I would have a meeting with my staff. My reports, some didn't have meetings, some had meetings, but the point in the organization, rumors start spreading about what was said and speculation, and you fill it in with negative conversation. So within 24 hours of my meeting, all my staff all my supervisors had to have their meeting. That way, the rumors, and we had talking points. We would bring staff in for risk communication training. We opened our books. We let the executive management team be, we invited supervisors and staff in to just view it. We couldn't let everybody in at the same time, so we had a random pick. And anybody on any level of the organization could come in to see the business of public health, the constraints of public health, why decisions are made, and why you can get a computer but I can't hire this person. It's because I have 4 different pots of money, and this pot does this, and this pot does this. It's to hear the mandates, it's to hear, and it's to engage in how we do our business. The biggest piece for me, my goal, and I'm sorry this is a long thing, but we did so many things, and it's about, it gets to the issue of change. you almost have to move people. You almost have to keep something constantly in front of them to remind them that change is a part of our life, so they don't ever become complacent again. So my whole charge to me was to get everybody, from the person who took care of our floors to my top level CFO, to understand the business, and it was our business, not just my business. So, and it over time, you know, I think we had some good results in that area.
It sounds like what you were also about, what you described, is really a culture change within the organization,
tremendously.
because you were opening things up, you were making it very transparent, you were sharing information. You also did that, which is very interesting, you were, in a sense, proactively addressing sort of the rumor mill by saying, that's just going to
yes.
happen in an organization, but you acknowledged it straight up.
That's right.
And that showed that you really understood sort of the dynamics.
I wasn't scared of it.
Yeah.
And from then on out, every all-hands meeting we had, which weren't a part of the fabric, the first thing we start off with, okay, tell me the rumors. What's the rumors of the day? And we'd address them. I'd have my managers address them. And it began to be a joyful thing after that point. But it was a wonderful journey, and I think that I wouldn't have had the opportunity to be where I am today if it wasn't for those kind of lessons learned and those kind of affirmations, you know, come in through that part of my life.
That's cool. That is wonderful. Let's talk a little bit about the sort of, you had, in a sense, the internal job within the health department as director of that organization. You've talked a little bit about that whole dynamic. You referred a minute ago to the Board of Health. You had this external involvement. And so as in that leadership position you were in a sense, you had an internal job within the Department of Health. And then you had a lot of external responsibilities within the community. You described something to me when you were in Nashville about how you were viewed externally in terms of your role with respect to health in the community. Those seem like a little bit different kinds of things. Could you say a little bit more about that external part of what you did?
Well, it became, over the 11 and a half years that I was Director of Health, those two dynamics really became one because of our strategic anticipation and thoughtfulness. There were times when the external was very aggressively outspoken on issues around the health department, and you can imagine what some of those were. But then there was a moment when, as we got more out in community, removing our walls, after all, why should people have to come to us? Why can't we be where they are? And there was a moment where, over like a 6-year period of one mayor who just specifically cut the health department and not the rest of the departments, because did not quite understand why we were into violence and why we were into mental health and why were we into tobacco. You just didn't understand that. And so we got out into the community, created these community health action teams where we moved teams of people out into the community. We actually placed them there. They created community processes with Nashvillians. And so about the 7th time that the mayor was about to cut us, we got these kind of phone calls. Dr. Bailey, you don't have to go up. We will go to council. After all, you're the mother of health. You cause us to wash our hands. And that's what they presented in front of council. And the council had they could put our money back that was being cut, and they did. You know, so it's getting real true engagement of your community and owning our business internally, you know, and that caused those kind of dynamics between the internal and the external sort of become one over time.
And having those groups, those external groups constituted, which is part of what you did, then ultimately led to them advocating for you.
Yes.
within the political arena, and then it all sort of merged together. Is what
Over
you're
a
saying.
period of 10 and a half years, while people were losing money across the nation, our budget, annual budget before I took directorship was about $27 million a year. And by the time in those 10 and a half years, we were up to about $62 million because we began to get stuff. They began to give us stuff because we managed well. We managed with courage. We managed with integrity. We didn't whine. We presented our facts. Our business, my business, was to give my bosses the best information I could give them for them to make the decisions. And we did that. And so our efficiencies and our management style netted in us getting stuff. More stuff to manage with not a whole lot of resources, but we still
But they had
did
confidence in
okay.
you. They knew that you were going to get the
Absolutely.
job done.
And the staff was always engaged, and we actually took our executive, we called ourselves the executive management team. The EMTs put in life back into the health department, and we actually took our meetings on a regular basis out to the different facilities,
really?
and then had all hands meetings at our 7 different facilities, you know, so that we can engage in conversation, and we would sit around in the circle, and if there were solid moments, that was okay. But it's amazing to see people begin to open up and to begin to trust that kind of process. And I think that's what you saw when you were in Nashville last week, you know, and it really is relational, and it really is precious. Really is precious.
Now, you had you mentioned your staff and your executive management team. Some of those people were people that you recruited, you handpicked for their particular positions. Could you say a little bit about what you look for? That's a key leadership challenge that all of us have faced. When you're looking for someone to fill a key position on your leadership team, how do you go about that? What's going through your mind? What are you thinking about? What do you do when you're picking these people?
I look at how they performed over a period of time is really something to be watchful for. I don't want head nodders. The worst thing that can happen to a director is to have a direct reports that just nods their head and think that I want them to be a yes person. It has to be someone that I know will give me honest feedback in order to help me be the best that I can be. And so I look for those kind of characteristics, and you know, you're realistic about expectations and goals and objectives, and realistic about conversations that you have. I think that's the biggest thing for me, and I try to be that same thing to you know, my boss. You know, giving the best information I have, not being a head nodder, trying to be as direct as possible. And that's what I mean, that's trustworthiness. Have to be able to trust you. Have to be able to trust you and know that you are the team player, not to the point that you just accept everything that's being said. You challenge it, but once we have come to a collective understanding of what it is that we're going forth with, that you sell it like you bought it.
What happens when things don't quite work out? You pick somebody, this is real difficult. When you think they're going to work out well and you put them in a position, but you sense it's just not working for whatever reason. You may have had that experience before. How do you go about dealing with that? That's a different scenario from having that great person that's always 100%.
That's right.
What do you do when it doesn't work out?
Go back to my mother again. Sometimes you could be direct and you could say no and there's no soft landing. But I think if relationships are in place enough and the conversations happen up front and along the way, so that no one is taken off guard when it truly is not working out, because it may not work out for the other person either. And I have to create the safe environment for them to say, you know, this is not working out for me. And then we explore why, and we both learn from that. But if it's not working out for me, it should not be a shock for that person that it is not. And that's one of the principles that I go by, it should not be a shock for them, because we've had our collective understanding of where we want to get to. We've had our collective understanding of what our objectives are. We're doing quality improvement and quality evaluations along the way, not just at 6 months or just at a year. So it shouldn't be a surprise. And the conversation, although hard, it is easier.
And what you're saying, too, is often that individual has a sense that it's not working themselves.
It could, right.
And there's sort of a...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Should.
Yeah.
Should.
If you're communicating along the way.
And if the characteristics of the person that you're surrounding yourself with have those kind of characteristics. But you try to create a team. We had a team of people that, some are very, very rigid. I know them very well. Some, will wait and see. And we had some that were on the cutting edge. One of the things I always remember is about the bell curve for people. And so if you start where they are, if I have the right attitude, I can give you the aptitude if I have the right attitude.
What about, you touched on this already a bit, Stephanie, people now that you report to, either a board or a
my
direct
boss.
report or whatever it is.
Yes.
You've already alluded to this some, but could you say a little bit more about what's going through your mind when you interact, say with, you had commissioners in Nashville, you had a board of health, you had people that you were relating to, there was a mayor, there were people there that were sort of up the hierarchy. What goes through your mind in relating to those kinds of folks?
Honesty. I am a reader of The Art of War, and I used to refer to my mayor not as the enemy, but you have to know your enemy. You have to know people, their strengths, their weaknesses, and you have to help the strengths produce what we want and play to those strengths. My mayor loved to be compared to other cities, so I would always introduce, well, this city's doing this. I knew his ego. And if we could be a little bit better than that city, then that's where we're going. And I have his support. And so managing up is about knowing your boss, knowing the Board of Health, knowing their vision, being clear about that, and so it gets back to the same points I've been making: relationships, clear understanding of why you are together on this mission, and then honest conversation, honest feedback, and direct conversation. Direct conversation.
So that you really are speaking sort of eye to eye, that sort of...
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
you're in a position here at CDC, been here for a couple of years now, I believe. You get asked to do a lot of things. You got asked to do a lot of things when you were in Nashville. How do you sort out, one of the challenges I think that many leaders face is when to say yes or no to a particular invitation to do something. It might be an invitation to speak or be on a committee or take on a new responsibility or activity. What's guiding you there in terms of when to say yes and when to say no to certain things?
I think two things are have guided me. One is what we're all about, our mission, our common mission. So you want to spend most of your time getting to our ultimate results, what we have collectively agreed on. The other thing that guides me on whether I do something or not is how it bumps up against my values and my principles. So those are the two things that I use, and they've worked well.
Final question has to do with balance. We've talked about this before. How does one, in the midst of all sorts of demands on your time, and work is a very demanding part of one's life, could you say a little bit about what you do that really helps in this area of balance and renewal that's so important over the long term?
Have conversations with people like you. No, I think one of the first things is that I give myself permission to not do anything. And I had to work on that. I had to actually, I have to actually give myself permission to just do nothing. So that works, the first part in giving myself permission. And then, being with, of course, my family, and now I have a new granddaughter, so that's joy. Reading, being an introvert, downtime is almost like you put your baby down for downtime. I need downtime. And so wherever I can gather that, wherever I can be alone, that's fine. And that goes back to my mother, because it was in those downtimes when she wasn't on, she thought we weren't looking, where I may catch her crying, I may catch her pain, you know, I may catch her just being just silent. And I think, you know, that's where I am, you know, in my downtime, when I'm not on camera, literally. That's when, you know, everything, I get to reflect on everything and see if I can sustain, if I can continue, if I'm energized. All those sort of things come into play at that point.
That's wonderful. This has been great. I've so enjoyed this. I've learned so many more things. Just to kind of sum up then, what are those 2 or 3 or the key things that come out of all of this, Stephanie, about leadership, about your thoughts on the subject?
The biggest thing for me, and I think for most leaders, is to know yourself. You have to know yourself and manage and lead from who you really are. You have to manage with courage and integrity. That's very key to me as well. Sometimes it really does come down to, as a leader, because I said so. Sometimes it comes down to that. The other thing is, I mentioned earlier about the bell curve of people. You have to respect that, because there are, when I say the bell curve of people, because people are at different places in their thinking, their listening, their readiness to move, to act, to whatever. And you have to understand that and start where people are. I always figured I could start where you are. The most resistant person that was coming at me for the health department, I started where they are, and we could move the conversation. The other piece is that, Kenny Rogers, you got to know when to let it go. And that's my biggest thing, is knowing when to just let it go. And I guess the last thing would be keeping the long view and constancy of purpose.
Great. Thank you. This has just been wonderful talking with you today. Thank you so much. This was great. Thank you all.
It got better.
It did.
I like talking to you anyway.